rumor that shook the NBA. What if everything we've been told about Victor Wembanyama's future is completely wrong? For weeks, whispers have been spreading throughout the NBA. Quiet conversations inside front offices, heated debates across sports media, endless speculation from fans trying to connect the dots. And at the center of it all stands the most valuable young superstar in basketball, Victor Wembanyama. The player many believe will dominate the NBA for the next decade. The player the San Antonio Spurs spent years rebuilding to acquire. The player who was supposed to become the next face of an entire franchise. But suddenly, a shocking question started making its way around the league. Is Victor Wembanyama truly happy in San Antonio? At first, the idea sounded ridiculous. Why would he leave? The Spurs gave him everything: a historic organization, a passionate fan base, a roster designed around his strengths, a future filled with championship possibility. Yet the rumors refused to disappear. In fact, they only became louder. Some insiders claim Wembanyama wanted a greater voice within the organization. Others suggested he expected to receive the same level of trust and influence once given to legendary Spurs superstars. Then came the moment that sent NBA fans into a frenzy. A controversial playoff incident, a costly mistake, a national spotlight, and suddenly, every camera in America was focused on Victor Wembanyama. The pressure was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The expectations were enormous. Every possession mattered. Every decision mattered. Every reaction mattered. For the first time since arriving in San Antonio, questions began to emerge about how the young superstar would respond when adversity finally arrived. Would he break? Would he grow? Or would this become the beginning of something much bigger? What happened next stunned everyone. Because the person who stepped forward wasn't a current coach, it wasn't a teammate, it wasn't a general manager. It was Gregg Popovich, the man who built the Spurs dynasty, the man who coached Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, and countless champions. The man whose voice still carries more weight inside the organization than almost anyone else. And what Popovich did behind the scenes would completely change the narrative surrounding Victor Wembanyama. This wasn't a public lecture. This wasn't a media stunt. This wasn't damage control. It was something far more powerful. Something personal. Something that revealed the true relationship between a legendary basketball architect and the young superstar expected to carry his legacy into the future. But before we get to that incredible moment, you need to understand why the entire NBA started believing these rumors in the first place. Because once the full story comes together, you'll realize this was never really about leaving San Antonio. It was about something much deeper. Something that could define the next decade of NBA history. Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from today. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. And if you believe Victor Wembanyama will become the best player in the world within the next 3 years, press 1-inch the comments. If you think another superstar will hold that crown, press 2. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join our basketball community, because what happened next completely changed the future of the Spurs. Why the league started believing it? The strange part wasn't that rumors existed. Rumors follow every superstar. The strange part was how many people were willing to believe this one. Victor Wembanyama wasn't acting like a typical NBA superstar. He wasn't chasing attention. He wasn't creating headlines. He wasn't posting cryptic messages on social media. In fact, he was doing the exact opposite. While most young stars spent their free time online, Wembanyama was building a lifestyle that seemed almost disconnected from modern professional sports. Teammates openly joked that he lived differently from everyone else. No endless scrolling through social media, no late-night distractions, no obsession with celebrity culture. After games, he reportedly avoided blue light exposure to protect his sleep cycle. Instead of staring at a phone screen, he preferred reading books. Instead of seeking attention, he focused on recovery. Instead of embracing the celebrity lifestyle that often comes with NBA fame, he seemed determined to become the best version of himself, both mentally and physically. The stories surrounding him became almost legendary. One of the most talked about involved his decision to spend time at a monastery in China. Not for publicity, not for a sponsorship, not for content, but to strengthen his focus, discipline, and mental toughness. That alone made him different. Yet being different can sometimes create misunderstanding. As Wembanyama's popularity exploded, so did expectations. Every great performance raised the bar higher. Every dominant game convinced fans they were watching the future of basketball. And during the 2026 playoffs, those expectations reached another level entirely. Game after game, Wembanyama delivered. 30-point performances became normal. Double-doubles became routine. Game-changing defensive plays became expected. The deeper San Antonio advanced, the more obvious it became that the franchise's future rested almost entirely on his shoulder. Then came one of the biggest moments of the postseason, a nationally televised showdown. The pressure was enormous. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and that's when everything suddenly changed. One controversial play, one emotional reaction, one costly mistake. In a matter of seconds, the conversation surrounding Wembanyama shifted. The discussion was no longer about his talent, no longer about his statistics, no longer about his future MVP potential. Instead, people began questioning his maturity, his decision-making, his leadership. Sports television exploded with debate. Analysts argued over whether the young superstar had let his emotions get the best of him. Former players questioned how such an important moment could unfold the way it did. Even some fans started wondering whether Wembanyama was truly ready for the responsibility of leading a championship contender. For the first time in his NBA career, the spotlight felt different. It wasn't admiration, it was scrutiny. And scrutiny can be dangerous for young superstars, because that's often when frustration begins. That's often when relationships become strained. That's often when cracks start to appear. The rumors that once seemed ridiculous suddenly gained new life. People began connecting events that may not have been connected at all. Every facial expression became a headline. Every interaction became a story. Every decision became evidence for whatever narrative someone wanted to believe. The basketball world was searching for answers, but they were looking in the wrong place. Because while television shows debated his future, while social media argued over his attitude, while fans speculated about what was happening behind closed doors, a conversation was about to take place that almost nobody saw coming. A conversation that wouldn't happen in an arena, a conversation that wouldn't happen in front of cameras, a conversation that would reveal just how important Victor Wembanyama had become to the Spurs organization. And more importantly, how important one man still was to Victor Wembanyama. That man was Gregg Popovich. And what happened at the airport would soon become one of the most talked about moments of the entire NBA playoffs. The airport meeting nobody expected. The Spurs had just suffered one of their most frustrating losses of the postseason. The locker room was silent. Every player understood what had happened. A critical game had slipped away, and Victor Wembanyama was suddenly at the center of the storm. Reporters were talking, analysts were debating, fans were questioning whether the young superstar was ready for this level of pressure. But while the NBA world argued from the outside, something far more important was happening behind the scene. When the Spurs landed back in San Antonio, Gregg Popovich was waiting. Not through a phone call, not through a team statement, not through an assistant coach. He was there in person. That image immediately went viral because everyone understood what it meant. Popovich no longer coached from the sideline, but his voice still carried more weight than anyone else's inside the Spurs organization. This was not about punishment. It was about accountability. For nearly 3 decades, Popovich built San Antonio on one simple standard. Stars are not protected from truth. They are shaped by it. And now, that same standard was being handed to Wembanyama. The rumors said there was distance between Victor and the Spurs, but this moment showed the opposite. Pop still cared enough to show up. Wembanyama still respected him enough to listen. Later, Victor made it clear that Popovich regularly spoke with the team during playoff battles, giving feedback and guidance when it mattered most. But this time was different. Pop wanted the message to be felt. And inside the Spurs locker room, when Pop speaks, everybody listens. That airport meeting did not prove Wembanyama wanted out. It proved San Antonio still had something most teams could only dream of: trust, history, culture, and a young superstar willing to be challenged by the man who built the dynasty before him. But nobody knew yet how strongly Wembanyama would respond, because the next time he stepped onto the court, he wasn't just playing to win. He was playing to answer every doubt. The secret bond between Pop and Wemby, to understand why that airport meeting mattered so much, you have to understand who Gregg Popovich really is. For nearly 3 decades, Popovich wasn't just the Spurs coach. He was the Spurs. 5 NBA championships, multiple Hall of Fame players, a culture respected throughout professional sports. From David Robinson to Tim Duncan, from Tony Parker to Manu Ginobili, every great Spurs era carried Popovich's fingerprints. He built a dynasty that survived generations. And then everything changed. In late 2024, Popovich suffered a stroke. Suddenly, the man who had spent almost 30 years leading from the sideline was facing the toughest battle of his life. The basketball world wondered if his coaching journey was over. When he eventually stepped away from the head coaching role, it felt like the end of an era. Players were emotional, fans were emotional. Even rival organizations understood the significance of the moment. But while Popovich left the bench, he never left the franchise. His influence remained everywhere. Inside practices, inside film sessions, inside locker room, inside the minds of players who had grown up learning from him. Perhaps nobody benefited more from that influence than Victor Wembanyama. When Victor arrived as the #1 overall pick, He entered an organization built on discipline, patience, and accountability. Those values didn't come from a handbook. They came from Popovich. Unlike many young stars, Wembanyama wasn't looking for short. He wanted knowledge. He wanted growth. He wanted to understand what separated good players from legendary ones. And there was no better teacher than Gregg Popovich. As their relationship grew, something unusual happened. The age difference disappeared. One was a seven-year-old basketball icon. The other was a young superstar expected to dominate the next generation. Yet they shared the same obsession: winning, learning, improving. Every conversation carried value. Every piece of advice mattered. Every lesson became another step in Victor's development. That's why the airport meeting wasn't shocking to people inside the organization. To them, it was completely normal. Because Popovich had always treated important moments personally. He understood that talent alone doesn't create champion. Character does. Leadership does. Accountability does. And Victor Wembanyama was still learning all three. The rest of the NBA saw a superstar in a retired coach. The Spurs saw something different: a mentor and his successor. A relationship that was becoming one of the most important foundations of the franchise's future. And soon, that relationship would face its biggest test yet. Because after the criticism, after the controversy, after the airport conversation, Victor Wembanyama was about to return to the court, and the entire basketball world was watching. The ejection that changed everything. For most young superstars, adversity arrives slowly. For Victor Wembanyama, it arrived in a single moment, one play, one decision, one mistake. And suddenly, the entire NBA was talking about him for all the wrong reasons. The Spurs entered Game 4 against Minnesota holding momentum and control of the series. Everything was moving in the right direction. Wembanyama was dominating. San Antonio looked like a legitimate championship threat. Then came the play that changed the conversation. Fighting for position after an offensive rebound, Wembanyama made contact with Naz Reid. Officials immediately reviewed the sequence. The arena fell silent. Players waited, fans held their breath. Then the verdict arrived: flagrant deux, ejection. Just like that, the Spurs' most important player was heading to the locker room. The reaction was immediate. Minnesota gained life. San Antonio lost its leader on the floor. And a game that felt under control suddenly became a battle for survival. Without Wembanyama, everything changed. The energy changed, the confidence changed, the outcome changed. The Timberwolves stormed back and eventually escaped with a crucial victory. The series was suddenly tied. But the scoreboard wasn't the biggest problem. The headlines were: sports networks replayed the incident nonstop. Analysts questioned his judgment. Former players criticized the lack of discipline. For the first time in his NBA career, Wembanyama wasn't being discussed as a future MVP. He was being discussed as a young star who may have let his emotions cost his team a playoff game. The criticism came from everywhere. Some called it immaturity. Others called it a learning experience. A few even wondered if the pressure was beginning to affect him. Fair or unfair, the narrative had changed overnight, and that's what made the moment so dangerous. Not because of the ejection itself, but because of what came next. Every superstar faces a crossroads, a moment when they can either let criticism define them or use it as fuel. The greatest players always choose the second option. Michael Jordan did it. Kobe Bryant did it. LeBron James did it. Now Victor Wembanyama was about to face his own version of that test. The questions were everywhere. How would he respond? Would the criticism linger? Would the pressure grow heavier? Or would he come back stronger than ever? Nobody knew the answer. But inside the Spurs organization, one person believed he did: Gregg Popovich. And after their unforgettable airport conversation, Pop was convinced that the young superstar was about to show the world exactly who he really was. The only question was how loud that response would be. And the answer would arrive in the very next game. Pop's most powerful message: the criticism surrounding Victor Wembanyama was growing louder by the day. Every sports show had an opinion. Every analyst had a theory. Some questioned his maturity. Others questioned his leadership. But inside the Spurs organization, nobody was panicked because they knew something the outside world didn't. Gregg Popovich had already seen moments like this before. He had watched young stars struggle. He had watched future Hall of Famers make costly mistakes. And he understood a simple truth: greatness is not measured when everything goes right. It's measured when everything goes wrong. That's why Popovich's message after the controversy wasn't about blame. It was about response. The Spurs didn't need excuses. They needed accountability. They needed focus. Most importantly, they needed to remember who they were. As the playoffs continued, Pop remained deeply involved behind the scenes. Players often described him as a constant source of wisdom. Even without coaching from the sideline, his presence could still be felt throughout the organization. Then came another critical moment, the Western Conference Finals against the defending champion Thunder. The pressure was enormous. The Spurs were fighting for a place in the NBA Final. And after a disappointing loss, frustration started creeping into the locker room. That's when Popovich stepped in. For the first time all season, he addressed the team immediately after the game. The message was direct. The Spurs hadn't lost because Oklahoma City was better. They lost because they failed to play with the mentality that defined Spurs basketball. That truth hit hard. Every player felt it. Every coach understood it, because when Popovich speaks, his words carry decades of credibility. There were no arguments. No excuses, only reflection. The team knew he was right. The defeat itself wasn't the biggest problem. The way they played was, and from that moment forward, everything changed. The focus returned. The energy returned. The urgency returned. The culture Popovich spent decades building suddenly came alive again. And standing at the center of it all was Victor Wembanyama, the same player who had been criticized only days earlier. The same player people were beginning to doubt. Now he had an opportunity to answer every question, and his response would be impossible to ignore. Because the next game wasn't just a playoff game. It became a statement. A statement from Wembanyama. A statement from the Spurs. And a statement that the NBA world would never forget. Wemby's revenge performance. The NBA loves redemption stories. But what Victor Wembanyama did next wasn't just redemption, it was domination. Only days after being criticized across national media, the young superstar walked back onto the court carrying the weight of expectations, scrutiny, and doubt. Most players would have felt the pressure. Wembanyama looked energized by it. From the opening minutes, it was obvious something had changed. His focus was sharper. His intensity was higher. His body language was different. Every possession felt personal. Every rebound felt personal. Every basket felt personal. The criticism that followed the ejection seemed to fuel him rather than break him, and Minnesota quickly became the victim of that response. Wembanyama exploded out of the gate. He attacked offensively. He controlled the glass. He protected the rim. Most importantly, he completely dictated the pace of the game. The Timberwolves had no answer. Every adjustment failed. Every defensive scheme collapsed. Whenever Minnesota appeared ready to make a run, Wembanyama shut the door. By the end of the night, the numbers were spectacular, but the statistics only told part of the story. What truly stood out was the confidence, the composure, the maturity. This wasn't a frustrated young star trying to silence critics. This was a franchise cornerstone showing exactly why the Spurs had placed their future in his hands. His teammates could feel it, the coaching staff could feel it, even Minnesota could feel it. The game wasn't just being played through Wembanyama, it was being controlled by him, and suddenly, the entire conversation changed. The media stopped discussing the ejection. The criticism disappeared. The doubts vanished. Instead, everyone was talking about the same thing. How do you stop Victor Wembanyama? The answer seemed impossible. At over 7 feet tall with elite mobility, elite skill, and elite defensive instincts, he looked less like a young player and more like a problem the league would be dealing with for the next decade. Even opposing players began acknowledging his impact, because when a superstar completely changes a playoff game on both ends of the floor, there is no denying what you're watching. This wasn't potential anymore. This wasn't projection anymore. This was reality. Victor Wembanyama had arrived, and as the Spurs continued their playoff journey, something became increasingly clear. The organization wasn't just building around a future superstar. They were building around a future face of the NBA, which leads to an even bigger question. If San Antonio had already built a contender around him, if the franchise had already committed everything to him, then why would anyone believe he wanted to leave in the first place? The answer reveals just how much the Spurs have invested in their generational superstar, and why his future may be even brighter than most fans realize. The Spurs built a kingdom around him. By this point, one thing was clear. The Spurs were not treating Victor Wembanyama like a normal star. They were building everything around him. When he arrived as the #1 pick, San Antonio was still rebuilding. Patience was supposed to be the plan, but Wembanyama changed the timeline. He was too talented to wait. So the Spurs moved faster. They brought in De'Aaron Fox, giving Wembanyama a proven star beside him. That move sent a message to the entire NBA. San Antonio was no longer just developing. San Antonio was trying to win. Even more impressive, the Spurs did it without destroying their future. They kept young talent. They kept draft assets. They kept flexibility. And still, they became dangerous. Then came the bigger picture. The organization was preparing for massive future contracts, long-term roster building, and a championship window centered completely around Wembanyama. But this story was never just about money. It was about trust. The team trusted him as the face of the franchise. His teammates trusted him as their leader. And Popovich trusted him as the next great Spurs cornerstone. That is why the rumors never fully made sense. Teams do not build a kingdom around a player they expect to lose, and players do not easily walk away from organizations that have committed everything to their future. Wembanyama was not standing near the exit, he was standing at the center of San Antonio's next dynasty. Why leaving makes no sense. By now, the narrative was falling apart. The rumors sounded dramatic, the headlines sounded convincing, but the facts told a completely different story. Think about it. Why would Victor Wembanyama want to leave a franchise that has spent years building around him? Why would he walk away from a team that handed him the keys from day one? Why would he abandon one of the most stable organizations in professional sports? The answer is simple. He wouldn't. Everything about San Antonio points toward a long-term partnership. The roster is improving. The young core continues to develop. A proven star like De'Aaron Fox is already in place. The organization still possesses flexibility to make future moves. Most importantly, the culture remains intact. Even after stepping away from coaching, Gregg Popovich's influence continues to shape the franchise. His values, his standards, his leadership, they are still part of the Spurs' identity. And that matters to a player like Wembanyama, because Victor has never looked like someone chasing shortcuts. He has never looked obsessed with bright lights or big markets. His focus has always been growth, improvement, winning. Those are the same principles that built the Spurs dynasty. That's why the relationship works. The organization gives him stability. He gives the organization a future. It's a perfect match. In reality, many of the rumors were created by something much simpler: expectations. When a player becomes this talented, people automatically assume he will eventually want more attention, more power, a bigger market, a different team. But not every superstar follows the same path. And Wembanyama has spent his entire career proving he is different. The playoff controversy, the criticism, the pressure, none of it pushed him away from San Antonio. If anything, it brought the team closer together, because difficult moments reveal the strength of relationships. And throughout this entire situation, the bond between Wembanyama and the Spurs only appeared stronger. Which brings us to the biggest question of all. If Victor Wembanyama never wanted to leave, then what was Gregg Popovich really revealing about him this entire time? The answer may be the most important lesson of this entire story, the real truth behind the headline. In the end, this story was never about Victor Wembanyama wanting to leave San Antonio. It was never about a trade request. It was never about frustration with the organization, and it certainly was never about a superstar searching for an escape route. The headlines made it sound dramatic. The rumors made it sound believable, but the reality was far more powerful. What Gregg Popovich revealed throughout this entire journey was not distance. It was connection. Every airport meeting, every conversation, every piece of advice, every moment spent guiding the young superstar pointed toward the same truth. Victor Wembanyama is exactly the type of player the Spurs hoped he would become. A player willing to learn, a player willing to listen, a player willing to be held accountable. Most young stars respond to criticism by becoming defensive. Wembanyama responded by becoming better. Most players facing intense pressure look for excuses. Wembanyama looked for solutions, and that's why people inside the organization remain so confident about the future, because talent alone doesn't create dynasties. Character does. Trust does. Leadership does. Those are the qualities Popovich spent decades building into Spurs culture. And now those same qualities are being passed to the next face of the franchise. When historians eventually look back on this era, they may not remember every playoff game. They may not remember every statistic. They may not remember every rumor. But they will remember the relationship, the bond between a legendary basketball architect and the young superstar chosen to carry the organization forward. A seven-year-old icon who refused to stop teaching, and a two-year-old phenomenon who never stopped learning. That's the real story, not a player preparing to leave. A player preparing to lead, not the end of an era, the beginning of a new one. The Spurs spent decades building one of the most respected cultures in professional sports. Now that culture belongs to Victor Wembanyama. The pressure is enormous. The expectations are historic. But if these playoffs proved anything, it's that Wembanyama is ready for the challenge. The future of the Spurs is not uncertain. It's already here, and the rest of the NBA may have to deal with that reality for a very long time. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with another NBA fan. And before you go, answer this question in the comments. Will Victor Wembanyama win an NBA championship within the next 3 seasons? Press 1 for yes. Press 2 for no. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.